I came home early and found my son and his wife walking through my house with a real estate agent. I asked, "What are you doing here?" My daughter-in-law calmly replied, "It's just a property evaluation. We need to know how much this house is worth." In that moment, I realized they no longer saw my home as a place filled with memories, but as an asset they wanted to take from me. Thank you so much for watching Silent Sweet Revenge. Your support means the world. Tell me down in the comments, what city or country are you watching from right now? Also, please keep in mind, this story includes dramatized elements tailored for entertainment and reflection. Any similarity to actual persons or settings is strictly coincidental, but the message shared here is valuable. The first thing I did when they were gone was stand on the back porch and count the geese on the lake. There were 11 of them, moving in a loose formation across the water, the kind of gray October morning that turns the surface of Seneca Lake into hammered silver. I stood there in my old wool cardigan, the brown one with the frayed left cuff that Martha had been threatening to throw away since 2011, and I counted those geese the way a man counts things when he needs his mind to be quiet for a moment. 11 geese. A sky the color of pewter. The smell of wood smoke drifting from Dot Simmons's chimney 2 properties down. The house behind me was still, not empty. I want to be clear about that. A house that has been lived in for 35 years is never truly empty. The floors remember where the furniture stood. The walls hold the particular silence of every conversation that was ever spoken inside them. But the ring lights were gone, and the backdrop stands, and the matching matte black canisters that had replaced Martha's ceramic set on the counter, all of it gone. What was left was the house I knew. My name is Walter Hayes. I am 71 years old. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer, the last 18 of them as a senior project manager for a firm out of Syracuse that built bridges and overpasses and once a pedestrian walkway over the Genesee River Gorge that I am still proud of every time I drive past it. I retired in 2018, 2 years after Martha passed, because working without her to come home to felt like building something with no foundation. I built this house myself. Not entirely alone, I hired out the electrical and the plumbing, because I am an engineer and not a fool, but the framing, the stonework, the floors, the porch, and every cabinet in the kitchen came from my own hands and Raymond Kowalski's pickup truck, full of reclaimed lumber from a demolished schoolhouse in Watkins Glen. We started in the spring of 1989, and Martha moved in before the upstairs bathroom had a door because she said she had waited long enough, and a door could come later. It did come later. 3 weeks later. She hung the towels before I'd even finished installing the hinges. This house sits on 4 acres at the southeastern edge of Seneca Lake, in the part of upstate New York where the growing season is short, and the winters are serious, and people who move here from the city either fall in love with it or leave by February. Martha fell in love with it the first afternoon we walked the property when the light came through the tree line at an angle that turned the whole field gold, and she grabbed my arm and said, "Hey, Walter, this is it." I had already made up my mind, but I waited for her to say it first. That was always how we worked best. She died in March of 2016, a Tuesday, from a stroke that came without warning, while she was sitting at the kitchen table grading papers from her watercolor class at the community center. I was in the garage. By the time I came in, she was already gone. The coffee was still warm in her mug. I did not pour it out for 3 days. Ethan called on a Tuesday in early March of this year, 7 years and 3 weeks after his mother died. He had that careful tone he's had since boyhood, the measured, slightly too casual voice he used when he wanted something significant and was hoping I wouldn't notice how significant it was. "Hey, Dad." A pause. "So listen. Things have gotten a little complicated on our end." I was sitting in the wingback chair by the window, the one that looks out toward the water. The lake was still half frozen. Ethan explained that he had left his position at the financial firm in Columbus. He called it a mutual decision, which I had learned over the years was a phrase that meant the decision had not been mutual, and that Vanessa's content work had slowed down considerably, and that their apartment lease was ending, and that they needed somewhere to land while they figured out the next step. "Just for a few months, Dad," he said. "We'd be out of your hair by summer." I looked at the wingback chair across from mine, the one that had been Martha's, the one where she used to sit with her sketchbook in the evenings. Her feet tucked under her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, even when she wasn't reading. I had not moved that chair since she died. I had not moved it, and I had not sat in it, and some mornings I still set 2 coffee mugs on the table between us out of habit before I caught myself. "All right, son," I said. "Come home." I believed when I said it that I was doing what a father does. I believed that the man I had raised understood what it meant to be welcomed back into the house where he grew up, and that he would carry that understanding carefully the way you carry something that belongs to someone else. I was wrong about that. I know that now, standing on this porch in October watching 11 geese moving across the silver water in the cold morning light. I was wrong about a great many things, but I was right about one: this house was worth fighting for. And by the time I understood that a fight was what was required, I had already been preparing for it longer than either of them knew. The geese reached the far shore and disappeared into the reeds. I went inside and put the kettle on. They arrived on a Saturday morning in the second week of March, when the last of the winter snow was pulling back from the lawn in thin, dirty patches, and the lake was the color of old iron. I had spent the previous evening moving the guest room furniture around to make space the way you do when someone is coming to stay, tucking the extra chair into the corner, clearing the closet down to 2 bare rods, setting fresh towels on the bed that Martha had quilted herself the winter of 1997. White and cream, a double wedding ring pattern. I smoothed the quilt flat with both hands before I went to bed the way she used to do it, pressing each seam down with her palm. Ethan pulled in first, his sedan riding low with boxes stacked to the roof. He climbed out, stretched his back with both fists pressed against his spine, and gave me the kind of hug that men give each other when they are relieved, but do not want to say so out loud. One arm, firm, brief. He smelled like fast food and highway miles. "Thanks for this, Dad," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, enough that I pretended not to notice. "Help me get the door," I said. Vanessa pulled in 3 minutes later in a white SUV I had not seen before. She stepped out wearing sunglasses despite the flat gray sky, her dark hair pulled back in the kind of effortless arrangement that I suspected took considerable effort. She was carrying a small camera and a travel mug, and looking at the front of my house the way a contractor looks at a job site, measuring angles with her eyes, calculating light. "Oh, Walter," she said, spreading her free arm wide as if she intended to embrace the entire property. "This place is even better than the photos." I had not sent her any photos. She walked past me toward the porch, stopped at the railing and held up her camera toward the lake. She took 3 photographs before she had said another word to me. Then she turned, saw me watching, and smiled the way people smile when they have been caught doing something they do not think requires an apology. The light out here is incredible," she said. "I might want to shoot some content from the porch. Would that be okay?" "Of course," I said. That was the first thing I gave away without understanding what I was giving. They unloaded for 2 hours. Ethan carried boxes, Vanessa directed. I helped with the heavier items because I am 71 years old and still capable of carrying my own weight, regardless of what anyone assumed about that. By noon, the guest room was buried under duffel bags and wardrobe boxes, and the hallway held a collection of equipment I did not immediately recognize. Collapsible metal stands, rectangular panels wrapped in black nylon, a case the size of a small coffin that Ethan carried with 2 hands and set down with excessive care. "What's in that one?" I asked. "Vanessa's main camera setup," Ethan said. "It's worth more than my car." I looked at the case, then at my hallway, then at Ethan. "She can set up in the guest room," I said. "She was actually hoping to use the living room sometimes," Ethan said, and there was that careful tone again. The one from the phone call, the one he had perfected over 38 years of wanting things he was not sure I would give him. "Just for natural light. The windows face southwest, which is, she says, it's ideal." "Occasionally," I said. "Right," he nodded. "Just occasionally." Occasionally. I have thought about that word many times since. It is one of those words that sounds like a boundary, but functions like a door left open. By 2 o'clock, Vanessa had walked through every room on the main floor, with her camera pausing at windows, crouching near the fireplace, running one hand along the surface of the bookcase. Raymond and I had built from the schoolhouse lumber. She did not ask before she touched it. She just touched it the way people touch things in stores. "This is gorgeous," she said. "Is it original to the house?" "I built it," I said, "in 1991. She looked at me for the first time with something that was not calculation, something closer to surprise. "You built it yourself?" "Raymond helped," I said. He held the pieces. I fitted the joints. She took a photograph of the bookcase. Then she moved on to the kitchen, where she stood at the window above the sink, and took 4 more photographs of the lake view, her coffee going cold in her hand. Dot Simmons appeared at my back door at 3 o'clock, the way she had been appearing at my back door for 22 years, with a covered dish and no particular excuse required. "Chicken and rice," she said, holding out the casserole. Then she looked past my shoulder at the hallway full of equipment cases and ring light stands and the general evidence of significant arrival. "Company. Ethan and his wife," I said. "Staying for a while." Dot had known Ethan since he was 9 years old. She looked at the hallway again. Then she looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for things she had opinions about, but had not been asked to share. "Well," she said, "you need anything, you know where I am." I thanked her for the chicken and rice. She patted my arm once and went back across the yard. That evening, Vanessa posted the first photograph. I saw it when Ethan showed me on his phone, proud in the way he was proud of things that had nothing to do with him. The image showed my porch railing and my lake and my tree line at the edge of the property, the late afternoon light cutting through the bare branches exactly the way it had been cutting through those branches for 35 years. The caption read, "Our new beginning." I handed the phone back to Ethan. I went to the kitchen and finished the dishes. I did not say what I was thinking, which was this: that light had been there every evening since 1989. Martha and I had watched it together thousands of times. It did not belong to a caption. The construction log was a green hardcover notebook, the kind with the black binding along the spine, and I had kept it in the same place for 35 years, bottom shelf of the oak cabinet in the corner of the living room behind the row of Martha's watercolor instruction books. I went looking for it on a Wednesday afternoon, the second week, after Ethan and Vanessa moved in, because I wanted to check the original load calculations for the back porch. The boards along the east end had developed a soft spot over the winter, and I had been meaning to assess whether it was the joists or the decking, and looking at the original specs always helped me think more clearly. I had designed this house the way I designed every structure, with full documentation, every measurement recorded, every material decision noted in my own handwriting. The cabinet was gone, not moved a few feet, not pushed into a corner, gone from the living room entirely along with the row of Martha's watercolor books, the ceramic lamp she had bought at a craft fair in Ithaca in 2003, and the small framed photograph of the two of us standing in front of the house frame in 1989 before the walls went up, grinning like people who do not yet know how much work is still ahead of them. My chest tightened the way it does when something is wrong that you cannot immediately name. I stood in the corner of my own living room and looked at the pale rectangle on the floor, where the cabinet's feet had pressed into the rug for 3 decades, and I felt the particular vertigo of a man who has walked into a room he has known his entire adult life and found it rearranged by someone else's logic. I found the cabinet in the basement, not near the stairs where you might put something temporarily while you figured out where it belonged. In the far corner of the wine cellar behind the metal shelving unit, in the spot where the stone foundation sweated in cold weather and the air smelled permanently of damp and old mineral and the particular mustiness of things that were not meant to be stored there. Someone had wedged it into that corner deliberately. It had not drifted there on its own. I had to move 2 cases of Vanessa's equipment to reach it. The cabinet was intact. The construction log was inside along with Martha's watercolor books. The deed to the property, the original architectural drawings I had drafted by hand at my kitchen table in the winter of 1988, and the cedar box. The cedar box held Martha's ashes. I had brought her home from the crematory myself in February of 2016 and placed the cedar box on the top shelf of that cabinet because it was the piece of furniture in the house she had loved most. She used to run her hand along the grain of the oak when she passed it, the way people touch things that make them feel steady. I had thought when I put her there that it was a reasonable place for her to stay. I lifted the cedar box out with both hands. It was lighter than it should have been. That had surprised me the first time, 2 years after she passed, when I had moved the cabinet 6 inches to the left to replace a baseboard, and I had needed to lift the box down and had been caught off guard by the lightness of it. A person spends a lifetime taking up space, and then the part of them that remains fits in a cedar box you can carry with one hand. And the weight of that fact is something you never fully get used to. I carried the box upstairs and set it on the dresser in my bedroom. Then I went back for the construction log, the deed, and the drawings. Then I stood at the top of the basement stairs and called for Vanessa. She came out of the living room with her phone in her hand and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and when she saw my face, she tilted her chin up slightly, a small adjustment, barely visible, the kind a person makes when they are preparing to hold a position. "The cabinet," I said. "Martha's cabinet. Why is it in the basement?" "Oh, that." Her voice was perfectly even. She was good at even. It wasn't working with the visual flow of the room, Walter. The proportions were throwing off the whole southwest corner. I needed that wall clear for the lighting setup. She glanced at her phone briefly, then back at me. I was going to mention it. My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my back teeth. Martha had chosen that cabinet from a woodworker in Trumansburg. In 1993 had driven out there twice to watch it being made. Had paid for it with money she had saved from 2 semesters of teaching watercolor to retirees at the community center. She had loved that piece of furniture the way she loved things that were made by hand, by people who cared about what they were making. "It wasn't a decorating choice," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. Sometimes quiet is what happens when you are working very hard to say exactly the right thing and nothing else. That cabinet has personal items in it. My wife's ashes are in that cabinet. Something moved across Vanessa's face. Whether it was shame or recalculation I could not tell, and I am not sure the difference would have mattered. "I didn't realize," she said. I looked at her for a moment. Then I turned and went back to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed with the cedar box on the dresser in front of me. "Martha," I said to the room, "I am going to need you to be patient with me. I am still working out what exactly is happening here. The room gave me the answer it always gives me. Silence and the sound of the lake outside the window and the faint creak of the house settling around me the way it has settled for 35 years. I put my hand flat on the cedar box lid. The wood was smooth and cool. I stayed there until I heard Vanessa's voice float up from downstairs, bright and practiced, beginning a video. The list appeared on a Monday morning in the third week of April, printed on white cardstock and fixed to the front of my refrigerator with a magnet that had been a souvenir from Niagara Falls, a magnet Martha had bought on our 25th anniversary trip. Back when we were the kind of people who bought souvenir magnets and thought that was a fine thing to do. The list was titled, House Schedule Shared Spaces. It was formatted in 2 columns, the left side listing the time block, the right side listing the designated use. Kitchen access for personal cooking was restricted to before 7 in the morning or after 11 at night on filming days, which according to a separate notation at the bottom of the card, was every weekday and most Saturdays. The living room was unavailable from 9 to 1 due to what the card called natural light optimization. The back hallway, my back hallway, the one I had walked through every morning for 35 years to get from the bedroom wing to the kitchen, was designated a transitional quiet zone during recording hours, which meant no loud footsteps and no phone calls taken within earshot of the main shooting area. I read the list twice. I took the Niagara Falls magnet off the refrigerator, held it in my palm for a moment, then put it in my shirt pocket. Then I read the list a third time. I had been making scrambled eggs for breakfast since 1974. 3 eggs, a knob of butter, low heat, the way my mother taught me in her kitchen in Rochester when I was 19 years old and thought I knew everything and was wrong about nearly all of it. Martha had called my scrambled eggs the only thing I made better than she did, which was generous because she was the far better cook. But I had held on to that compliment for 50 years, like a man holds onto a good tool carefully and with appreciation for the person who gave it to him. That morning, I made toast. Ethan came into the kitchen at 7:45, poured himself coffee from the pot I had already made, and set a plastic cafeteria tray on the counter beside the toaster. It was beige institutional, the kind of tray you see in hospital cafeterias and school lunchrooms with the divided sections molded into the surface. Vanessa thought this might help, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. So you can take your breakfast out to the porch. She's setting up in about 20 minutes and the kitchen is kind of part of the shot today. I looked at the tray. Then I looked at my son, who was 38 years old, and standing in my kitchen explaining to me that I would be eating my breakfast on a plastic tray on my own porch, because the kitchen was part of the shot today. All right, I said. I put my toast on the tray. I added my coffee mug. I carried it out to the back porch and sat in the wooden chair I had built from white oak in the summer of 2004. And I ate my toast and drank my coffee and looked out at the lake, which was beginning to show the first green along the far shore where the willows were coming in. It was not a bad place to eat breakfast. I want to be fair about that. The porch faces east, and in April the morning light comes in low and clean, and the lake is usually still before the wind picks up, and there are worse things than eating toast outdoors in the early spring. But I had not been asked. That was the part that sat in my chest, like a stone, not the porch, not the toast, but the fact that the question had never been put to me at all. From inside the kitchen, I heard Vanessa's voice shift into a register I had come to recognize, warmer, rounder, slightly slower than her regular speaking voice, the voice she used when she was recording. "Good morning, friends," she said, bright as a bell. "Starting today with gratitude and this absolutely gorgeous lake view. I just feel so blessed to be here." I drank my coffee. 3 days later, my neighbor Bill Rafferty called me from his cell phone, which he rarely used, and usually called his "the dang thing," to tell me he had seen a video of me on his daughter's iPad. She had shown it to him at Sunday dinner. He said I looked very peaceful sitting on the porch, and that the young woman in the video seemed very nice, and that his daughter had watched several of her videos and found them very uplifting. I thanked Bill and told him I was glad his daughter was enjoying herself. After I hung up, I found the video on Ethan's laptop, which was open on the kitchen table. Vanessa had filmed me through the kitchen window without my knowledge. I was visible in the background of the shot seated on the porch, with my tray looking out at the lake. In the video, I appeared to be a contented elderly man enjoying a peaceful morning beside the water. The caption read, "Taking care of family is the greatest privilege. So grateful for this season of life." The video had 412,000 likes. I stood in my kitchen and felt something move through me that I did not immediately have a name for. It was not quite anger, though anger was part of it. It was closer to the feeling I got on job sites when I discovered that a subcontractor had altered the load-bearing specifications without telling me the cold, clarifying recognition that something structurally important had been changed without my knowledge or consent, and that the consequences of that change were going to require my full attention. I closed the laptop. I went to my workbench in the garage and spent an hour organizing bolts by size into labeled glass jars, which is what I do when I need my hands to be busy while my mind works through something serious. By the time the jars were organized, I had made two decisions. The first was that I needed to talk to Raymond sooner rather than later. The second was that I was going to start making scrambled eggs again in the morning, before 7 on my own schedule in my own kitchen, the way my mother taught me in 1974. Some things are not negotiable. That is something Martha understood about me, and something I had briefly forgotten, and something I did not intend to forget again. I found Martha's face on the floor on a Tuesday morning in late April, folded in half, and pushed partway under the baseboard of the bookcase. It was a photograph from our trip to Acadia National Park in the summer of 2001. Martha, standing at the top of Cadillac Mountain, with both arms out, laughing into the wind, her hair doing whatever it wanted in every direction. The Atlantic Ocean going all the way to the horizon behind her. She had been 53 years old that summer, and had hiked 4 miles that morning before I had finished my second cup of coffee. In the photograph, she looked like a woman who had never in her life been afraid of anything. I picked it up carefully the way you pick up something fragile that should not be on the floor. I smoothed the fold with my thumb. Then I looked at the bookcase and at the frames on the second shelf, which I had not looked at closely in several weeks, and I understood immediately what had happened. The frames were the same. Dark walnut rectangular, the set of 8 that Martha had bought at an estate sale in Canandaigua in 2009 because she liked the consistent look of them lined up together. But the photographs inside the frames were not ours anymore. Where our wedding portrait had been, the black and white one, 1978 Martha in her grandmother's lace. Both of us squinting slightly against the afternoon sun because the photographer had put us facing west. There was now a large format print of a kitchen counter with a linen napkin folded beside a ceramic bowl. Where the photograph of Ethan's first birthday had been with the smashed cake and the expression of pure astonishment on his face, there was a close-up of wildflowers in a mason jar. I went through all 8 frames. Our family was gone. In its place, a curated arrangement of what Vanessa's Instagram page called intentional living content. Soft colors, clean surfaces, objects that existed to be photographed rather than used. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the 5th frame. Not trembling, not slightly unsteady, shaking the way my hands shook the morning after Martha died when I tried to pour coffee and couldn't hold the pot level. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed through my nose and told myself to be methodical, because that is what I know how to be when something is falling apart around me. I found the rest of our photographs in a cardboard box under the daybed, in the sunroom, stacked without tissue paper, without any particular care. The way you pack things you do not think matter very much. I sat on the floor beside the box and went through every photograph with both hands checking for damage. Most were fine. 4 had bent corners. The Acadia photograph, the one of Martha with her arms out on top of the mountain, I had already smoothed as best I could. I was still sitting on the sunroom floor when Ethan appeared in the doorway. "Dad." His voice had the careful quality of someone who knows they are standing on uncertain ground. "I can explain." "Can you?" I said. It was not a question. He came into the room and crouched down near me, his elbows on his knees. He was wearing the expression he had worn at 15 when he put a dent in the garage door with a baseball and waited 2 days before telling me. Guilty, but more uncomfortable with the guilt than with the thing that caused it. "She needed the frames," he said, "for a brand partnership. The sponsored content required a cohesive aesthetic across the whole shelf, and she thought she was going to put everything back. Dad, she just needed them for the shoot." "Ethan." My voice came out with an edge I had not planned. "These are photographs of your mother." He flinched. His jaw tightened, and he looked at the floor, and for a moment he looked so much like Martha. The same angle of the jaw, the same habit of looking down when something hit too close, that something in my chest cracked open a little bit before I could stop it. "I know," he said quietly. "I know, Dad. I'm sorry." I nodded. I put the photographs back in the box and stood up from the floor, which took more effort than it once did, and which I refused to make into a production. I carried the box to my bedroom and put it on the closet shelf where I could account for it. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't open it, but the preview line read Facebook Marketplace, and something made me stop. The listing showed a rocking chair. Solid oak, hand-finished, 1991, the posting said. Good condition. $180. The seller's account name was something generic, 3 letters and a number, the kind of account that exists for a single transaction and then disappears. I recognized the chair from the photograph. I had built it in the summer of 1991 in the garage over 4 weekends. Because Martha had mentioned once, just once, not as a request, just as an observation, that she had always liked the idea of a rocking chair on the porch. I had not told her I was building it. I had carried it out to the porch on a Sunday morning in August and left it there and gone back inside. And when she came out for her coffee, she stood in the doorway and pressed both hands over her mouth and made a sound that I have never found the right words to describe and have never needed to. I called the number on the listing. Vanessa answered on the 3rd ring. "This chair," I said. "The one in the marketplace listing." "Where is it?" A pause. Then, "Oh, that." Her voice was perfectly controlled, perfectly reasonable. "It was taking up space on the porch, Walter. It's not really being used. I thought if someone else wanted it, I'll give you $200 for it," I said. Another pause. Shorter this time. "Okay," she said. I drove to the storage unit where she had apparently already moved it, without mentioning that to anyone, paid her $200 in cash, loaded the chair into my truck, and drove it home. I set it back on the porch in its original position facing the lake, and I sat in it for a long time while the afternoon light moved across the water and the willows along the far shore bent in the wind. I thought about Martha carrying it out to the porch that August morning 34 years ago, the sound she made when she saw it, her hands pressed over her mouth. I thought about what it meant that my son's wife had put that chair in a storage unit and listed it for sale, and what it meant that my son had known and said nothing, and what it meant that I had just paid $200 for something that had always been mine. The doorbell camera had been Raymond's idea. He had driven up from Buffalo 2 years ago to spend a long weekend fishing on the lake, and on his second evening here, he had stood on my front porch with a beer in his hand, looked at the empty bracket above the door where the old intercom used to be, and said, "Walter, you live alone on 4 acres, and the nearest neighbor is 200 yards away. Get a camera." I had put it off for 6 months, the way I put off most things that felt like admissions that I was older, that the world had changed, that being careful was no longer optional. But I had eventually installed it myself on a Saturday morning in November, following the instructions with the same methodical attention I gave to any technical task, and the camera had sat above my front door ever since, recording motion-triggered clips to an app on my phone that I checked approximately never. I checked it on a Thursday night in the second week of May at 11:43 in the evening because I had heard a sound from the front of the house that I could not identify, and I did not want to walk out there without knowing what I was walking toward. The sound turned out to be a raccoon working at the lid of the recycling bin. I watched the clip twice to confirm, and then, because the app was open and because something had been sitting in my chest for 3 weeks, like a stone I could not cough up, I scrolled back through the motion archive. The clips were sorted by date. Most were ordinary: the mail carrier Dot coming across the yard with a casserole, the UPS driver leaving packages a deer at the edge of the lawn just before dawn on 3 separate occasions. I scrolled back to late March, the week after Ethan and Vanessa arrived. The clip was dated March 26, 11:18 in the morning. Ethan was standing on the front porch with his phone pressed to his ear directly below the camera bracket, close enough that the built-in microphone had picked him up without difficulty. He had his back to the camera, but the audio was clear. New York State, unlike some states, does not require all parties to consent to being recorded in a location where they have no reasonable expectation of privacy, and my front porch, which is visible from the road and accessible to anyone who walks up the path, qualified. The camera recorded what it recorded. I listened to my son's voice. Just keep pushing," Ethan said. His tone was not the careful, measured tone he used with me. It was faster, more certain, the voice of a man speaking to someone he did not need to manage. "Move whatever you need to move. He's not going to say anything. He never does." A pause. Then, "He spent his whole life being the guy who holds everything together and never complains. He's not going to start now." Another pause, longer. Then Ethan laughed at a short, flat sound and said, "Trust me, I know my father." The clip was 47 seconds long. I listened to it 3 times. I want to be precise about what happened inside me when I heard those 47 seconds, because I think precision matters here, and because I have spent enough years as an engineer to know that when you misidentify what a structure is actually doing, you make the wrong repairs, and the problem gets worse. It was not rage. I have felt rage before, the hot, disorganizing kind that makes your vision narrow and your hands useless, and this was not that. What moved through me when I heard Ethan's voice was something colder and more architectural. It was the feeling of a load-bearing wall turning out to be decorative. The feeling of discovering that something you had built your structural calculations around was not what you had believed it to be, had never been what you believed it to be, and that everything you had constructed on top of that assumption was now in need of complete reassessment. I had told myself through every week of the breakfast trays and the rearranged furniture and the cedar box in the basement and the photographs in the cardboard box that Ethan was caught between his wife and his father, that he was a man of limited courage, being pulled in 2 directions, that his silence was weakness rather than strategy. That version of events had allowed me to be angry at Vanessa and to grieve for my son at the same time, which is a more comfortable arrangement than the alternative. The alternative was what I was sitting with now in my wingback chair at midnight, in a house that had gone quiet around me. My son was not caught between his wife and his father. My son had given his wife the map and told her where the doors were, and confirmed that the man inside would not lock them. I sat in the dark for a long time. The lake made its sound outside the particular small sound it makes on still nights, just a suggestion of movement against the shore. Martha had loved that sound. She used to say it was the lake reminding you it was still there. I had never told her that I found that comforting, because there are things you assume you will have time to say, and then run out of time before you say them, and that is one of the smaller griefs you carry alongside the larger ones. At 1:15 in the morning, I picked up my phone and called Raymond. He answered on the second, which meant he had not been asleep, which meant he was either reading or watching baseball, and I did not ask which because it did not matter. "Ray, I said. "Walter." He knew from my voice. Raymond has known my voice for 43 years through the building of bridges and the raising of children and the loss of spouses and every other thing that constitutes a life. And he knew from a single word what category of call this was. "I need to come down to Buffalo," I said. "Not this weekend, but soon." "Come whenever you're ready," he said. "The guest room is made up," I thanked him. I ended the call. I sat in the chair until nearly 2 in the morning, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about everything with the cold, systematic attention of a man who has just discovered that the problem is more serious than he thought, and that the solution is going to require more precision than he had originally planned. I did not sleep much that night. But I was not afraid. Ethan brought it up on a Friday morning casual as a weather report. He was standing at the kitchen counter with his coffee scrolling through his phone, and he said it the way you say something you have been rehearsing long enough that you have ironed all the rehearsal out of it. "Hey, Dad, I went ahead and scheduled you a checkup. Just a routine thing, general wellness, make sure everything's running right. Dr. Garfield over in Ithaca, Tuesday at 10. I was at the table with my scrambled eggs. My own eggs made before 7 in my own pan, on my own schedule, as I had decided 3 weeks ago I would continue to do. I looked at my son. "Dr. Patterson has been my physician for 22 years, I said. "I know, but Dr. Patterson is all the way in Geneva, and Dr. Garfield is highly rated, and it's just a wellness check." Ethan set his mug down and finally looked at me directly, which he had been doing less and less since March. "I thought it would be good. You've seemed tired lately." I had not seemed tired. I was sleeping 5 to 6 hours a night, which was what I had always slept, and I was walking 2 miles along the lake road every morning before breakfast, which was what I had always done, and my blood pressure was 118/74, which I knew, because I checked it on the cuff in my bathroom every Tuesday. But I looked at my son and said, "All right, Tuesday at 10. I had learned in the 2 weeks since the camera recording to be careful about what I confirmed and what I denied. A man who knows what is coming has the advantage of preparation. A man who reveals that he knows throws that advantage away. Dr. Garfield's office was in a medical arts building on the west side of Ithaca, the kind of building with a lot of glass and very little personality, the kind that goes up quickly and ages without distinction. The waiting room had the particular silence of places where people sit with things they are worried about. I filled out the intake paperwork, while Ethan sat beside me and checked his phone repeatedly, which he did whenever he was nervous. The nurse who took my vitals was efficient and pleasant, and wrote down my blood pressure 121/76, slightly elevated from the drive without comment. Dr. Garfield came in 12 minutes later. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s, with the kind of careful, measured manner that can mean either genuine thoughtfulness or practiced performance, and I was not immediately certain which it was. He shook my hand and sat across from me and opened his laptop. "So, Mr. Hayes," he said, "how have you been feeling generally?" "Fine," I said. "Healthy. I walk 2 miles every morning and my resting heart rate is 61. He nodded and typed something. Then he said, "I'd like to run through a brief cognitive assessment as part of the wellness evaluation. Completely routine. Just takes about 10 minutes. There it is, I thought. A cognitive assessment, formerly called a standardized mental status examination, is a series of questions and tasks designed to screen for impairment in memory, orientation, language, and executive function. The most common version asks patients to state the date count backward from 100 by sevens, repeat a short list of words, after a delay copy, a simple drawing, and follow a 3-step verbal instruction. It is used appropriately to screen patients who present with concerning symptoms and used inappropriately as a paper trail for people who want a document suggesting that an older person is not mentally competent. I knew this because I had looked it up. The day after Ethan suggested the appointment on my laptop in my bedroom with the door closed. "Of course," I said pleasantly. Dr. Garfield asked me the date. I told him it was Tuesday, the 20th of May, 2025, and that we were sitting in Tompkins County, New York, in the United States of America, and that the current president had been inaugurated the previous January. He blinked slightly, typed something, and moved on. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I did so without pausing. 93, 86, 79, 72, 65, 58. He held up a hand to stop me before I reached 51. He asked me to remember 3 words, Apple Honesty Tunnel, and told me he would ask me again in a few minutes. He showed me a drawing of 2 overlapping pentagons and asked me to copy it. I drew it accurately, added the measurement notations out of habit, and handed it back. He asked me to recall the 3 words. I said Apple Honesty Tunnel, and then I said, "The cognitive assessment you're administering appears to be a modified version of the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. The clinical threshold for concern is typically a score below 26 out of 30. I'd be interested to know my score when you've finished." Dr. Garfield looked at me over the laptop screen for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not quite discomfort, but a recalibration, the look of a man who had prepared for one kind of conversation and found himself in a different one. "You scored 30, he said. "Thank you," I said. On the drive home, Ethan said, "See all clear. That's great, Dad." I looked out the passenger window at the fields going by the early corn just beginning to show in the ones that had been planted, the others still brown and open. A pair of red-tailed hawks were working a thermal above the tree line to the east, rising in slow circles without moving their wings. "Ethan," I said, still looking at the window, "who referred you to Dr. Garfield?" A pause, brief but present. "A colleague," he said. "Someone from work. Someone from the job you no longer have," I said. He did not answer. The hawks rose higher. I watched them until the road curved and the tree line blocked them from view, and I said nothing else for the remaining 20 minutes of the drive because I had said what needed to be said, and everything else could wait. That evening, I called Dr. Patterson in Geneva and requested a complete copy of my medical records going back 15 years. She asked if everything was all right. I told her everything was fine, that I simply wanted my records in order, which was true. A man my age with a house in his name and a plan forming should have his records in order. I found the letter on a Tuesday morning in early June, wedged behind the accordion file where I keep the vehicle insurance documents in the metal cabinet on the left wall of the garage. I had gone out to the garage to get the torque wrench. The back porch board still needed attention, and I had been putting it off through the chaos of the previous 2 months, and I had decided that this morning I was going to deal with it regardless of what else was happening in the house. I pulled the accordion file out to reach behind it, and the envelope came with it, caught on the file's edge, and fell to the concrete floor face up. It was addressed to Ethan R. Hayes. The return address was a financial recovery firm in Columbus, Ohio. The envelope had been opened and refolded, which meant it had been read and then hidden rather than thrown away, which told me something about the nature of what was inside, before I had read a word of it. I stood at my workbench and read the letter. The amount was $247,000, which was not a number I had been expecting. The letter was the third notice from this particular firm, which meant there had been two previous notices that had either gone to a different address or been intercepted here before I saw them. The debt had originated from a series of investment accounts. The letter used the phrase, high-risk alternative assets, which is the language financial firms use when they mean cryptocurrency and leveraged speculation, and had been personally guaranteed by Ethan, meaning that when the investments failed, the liability attached to him directly and could not be discharged through the apartment lease he had surrendered or the job he had vacated. The letter stated that if the outstanding balance was not addressed within 45 days, the firm would pursue judgment against all assets held in Ethan R. Hayes's name. I put the letter back in its envelope. I put the envelope back behind the accordion file. I took the torquey wrench and went to work on the porch boards. I replaced 4 planks on the east end, sistered 2 joists that had developed rot at their bearing points, and applied a penetrating sealant to the entire deck surface. It took me 3 hours and 40 minutes. I worked without stopping because physical work is the only thing I know that reliably quiets the part of my mind that wants to run ahead of the available information and start drawing conclusions before the data is complete. When I finished, I was washing my hands at the utility sink when I heard the truck. It was a flatbed white with the logo of a building supply company on the door panel pulling a trailer loaded with demolition equipment. A reciprocating saw the length of my arm, a rotary hammer drill bags of material, and 2 men in work boots who climbed down from the cab and began unloading before anyone had come to the door. I walked around the side of the house. One of the men was consulting a work order on a clipboard. The other was already carrying the reciprocating saw toward my front door. "Can I help you?" I said. The man with the clipboard looked up. He was maybe 40, sunburned with the efficient manner of someone who spent his days completing jobs and had no particular interest in complications. "Hayes residence? We're here for the fireplace removal. Full demo substrate prep, new surround installation." He turned the clipboard around so I could see the work order. At the top of the work order in the field marked client name, it read, Vanessa M. Hayes, sole property owner. My jaw tightened. I kept my voice even because I have spent a great deal of my life keeping my voice even in situations that did not deserve evenness, and I have found that it gives you a considerable advantage over people who are expecting a different response. "There's been a miscommunication," I said. "This work has not been authorized by the property owner." The man with the clipboard frowned. "Ma'am, who called this in, said she was the owner. We got a signed contract." "The signed contract contains an error," I said. "I am the owner of this property. My name is Walter Hayes. The deed is in my name alone, recorded with the Schuyler County Clerk's Office in Watkins Glen, and has been since 1989. I would be happy to show you the document, but the work order you are holding is not valid authorization." He looked at his clipboard. He looked at me. He pulled out his phone and called someone, turning slightly away. I heard him say, "Ma'am, there's a gentleman here who says he's the actual owner, and he's saying we can't proceed." A pause. "Yes, ma'am, I understand. But we can't demo somebody's fireplace if the owner is standing here telling us to stop. That's a liability issue." Another pause. Then, "Yes, ma'am. I'll let him know." He turned back to me. "She says the work is authorized under her contract with the sponsoring brand." "A contract with a third party does not convey property rights," I said. "If you proceed, you will be performing unauthorized structural modification to a private residence. That exposes your company to civil liability. I'd recommend you speak with your supervisor before making that decision." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the house. Then he told the other man to reload the trailer. Simmons was standing at the edge of her property with a garden trowel in her hand, watching. When the truck pulled out of my driveway, she caught my eye across the distance between our yards and gave a single firm nod, the kind that means I saw that, and good. I nodded back. I went inside. Vanessa was standing in the kitchen doorway with her phone pressed to her ear, and when she saw me, her expression moved through three things: quickly surprise, calculation, and a decision before settling into the careful neutrality I had come to recognize as her default when circumstances had not gone as planned. She ended her call. She looked at me. "The fireplace was going to be replaced with something much more beautiful," she said. "The stone is dated. The brand wanted a clean marble surround, and it would have added real value to the—" "Vanessa," I said. I set the torque wrench on the counter. I looked at her steadily and felt something in my chest that was not anger, but was directly adjacent to it, something with weight and temperature. "My wife and I laid every stone in that fireplace in the summer of 1994. I mixed the mortar." She handed me the stones in the order we had sorted them together the weekend before, lightest at the base, darkest at the top, because she said it made the whole thing look like it was growing out of the ground. I paused. "No one is touching that fireplace." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked at her phone. Then she walked back down the way without another word. I stood in my kitchen and looked at the fireplace through the doorway. Every stone exactly where Martha and I had put it 31 years ago, still there. Vanessa announced the dinner party on a Monday, the way she announced most things, not as a question and not as information that required my input, but as a fact that had already been decided and was being shared with me as a courtesy. "We're having some people over Friday night," she said, not looking up from her laptop. She was sitting at my kitchen table, which had become her primary workspace in the mornings. "Colleagues, brand partners, a few friends from the city, maybe 15 people. I was thinking we'd use the good dishes." The good dishes were Martha's. A full service for 12 in cream-colored porcelain with a narrow band of cobalt blue around the rim, purchased piece by piece over 20 years from an antique dealer in Seneca Falls, who Martha had visited so regularly that the woman knew her by name and called her when something new came in. Martha had used those dishes for every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every occasion that she felt deserved the weight of something beautiful and real. "Those dishes are not for general entertaining," I said. Vanessa looked up from her laptop for the first time. "They're sitting in a cabinet," she said. "They should be used." I looked at her. She looked at me. Then she smiled the way she smiled when she had decided to treat a disagreement as a misunderstanding, which was a technique I had noticed she deployed when she wanted to move past resistance without acknowledging it. "It'll be a beautiful evening," she said. "Very tasteful." I went to my workbench in the garage and spent 20 minutes doing nothing in particular, which is different from working, and which I almost never do, which told me something about where I was in my patience. On Friday evening, Ethan appeared in the doorway of my bedroom at 5:15, wearing a collared shirt I had not seen before, and carrying the careful expression he wore when he was about to say something he knew I would not receive well. "Hey, Dad." He leaned against the doorframe. "So tonight's going to be kind of a work thing for Vanessa. A lot of her brand people, some content creators she collaborates with. They're not really, it might be a little loud, and the conversation is going to be pretty industry-specific." He cleared his throat. "Vanessa thought it might be more comfortable for you to have dinner in here." She set up a tray. On my nightstand was the beige plastic cafeteria tray. On it was a covered plate, a glass of water, and a folded paper napkin. I looked at the tray. I looked at my son in his new collared shirt standing in the doorway of my bedroom, telling me that I would be eating dinner alone on a plastic tray, while 15 strangers used Martha's dishes in my dining room. "All right," I said. Ethan's shoulders dropped slightly with relief, which was the thing I could not quite forgive him for, not the tray, not the dinner, but the relief. The fact that he had expected me to object and was grateful that I had not, and that his gratitude was for his own comfort rather than for mine. He pulled the door nearly closed behind him. Not all the way. Just enough. I sat on the edge of my bed and ate the dinner pot roast, which was competent, and green beans which were overcooked, and listened to the sounds of my house being someone else's party. Laughter I did not recognize. Music I would not have chosen. The particular bright noise of people performing enjoyment for each other in a room they found impressive. At some point I heard Martha's dishes being stacked. My bedroom is off the main hall, 20 feet from the dining room. Close enough that sounds carry through the wall on a quiet evening. The sound those dishes make is distinctive, a soft ceramic ring almost like a bell that I have heard at the end of every significant meal in this house for 30 years. I heard that sound 6 times through the wall, and each time it rang, I pressed my back teeth together and breathed through my nose. I had nearly finished eating when footsteps stopped outside my door and a knock came. Not Ethan's knock, too hesitant, too light. "Come in," I said. The young man who opened the door was perhaps 28 or 29, with the slightly rumpled look of someone who spent most of his time behind a camera rather than in front of one. He was carrying a coil of extension cord over one shoulder and holding a second covered plate in his other hand. "Mr. Hayes." He looked at the tray on my nightstand, then at the plate in his hand, and something moved across his face that I can only describe as the expression of a person who has just fully understood a situation they had been half ignoring. "I'm Caleb. I do the camera work for Vanessa. I was in the hallway and I thought maybe you hadn't gotten enough to eat, so I grabbed this from the kitchen." He held the plate out, then seemed to realize the awkwardness of the gesture. "I'm sorry. I should have knocked earlier. I wasn't sure if—" "Caleb," I said. "Sit down." He looked startled, as people do when they offer a small kindness and receive a direct response instead of a deflection. He sat in the wingback chair across from me, the cord still over his shoulder, the plate balanced on his knee. "How long have you been working with Vanessa?" I asked. 8 months, he said. "Since last fall." I nodded. "Do you enjoy the work?" He considered the question more seriously than most people his age consider questions from people my age. "I enjoy the camera work," he said carefully. "The rest of it is—" He stopped. "I should get back." "Of course," I said. He set the extra plate on the dresser beside Martha's cedar box and looked at the box for a moment with the involuntary attention people give to things that carry visible weight. "I'm sorry about your wife," he said. "Ethan mentioned she passed." "Thank you," I said. "She would have hated tonight. She hated fuss." He gave a short, surprised laugh, genuine, the kind you cannot plan. Then he pulled the door gently behind him, and his footsteps moved back down the hallway toward the noise. I sat with my back against the headboard and looked at Martha's cedar box on the dresser and listened to the party in my house reach its peak, and then slowly over the next 2 hours come apart at the edges the way all parties do, until the last car pulled out of the driveway and the house went quiet. And I heard Ethan and Vanessa in the kitchen speaking to each other in the clipped, efficient tones of people who are tired and have said everything that needed saying already. I packed my overnight bag that night. 5 days in Buffalo. Raymond's guest room with the window that faced the backyard maple. I packed the Torca wrench in the truck bed because there were two things I needed to do while I was gone, and one of them required tools and the other required Raymond. In the morning before I left, I went to the dining room. Martha's dishes were washed and stacked on the counter, not yet returned to the cabinet. I picked up one of the dinner plates and turned it over. On the back, in the thin cursive of the original maker, it read, Seneca Pottery Est, 1887. I put it back carefully, face up, exactly where it had been. Then I went to get my bag. I had 5 days. I intended to use all of them. Raymond Kowalski lived in the same house in South Buffalo that he had bought with his wife Gloria in 1981, a 2-story colonial on a street of 2-story colonials where the maple trees had grown tall enough over 40 years to arch across the road and meet in the middle, making a tunnel of shade in the summer that Raymond said was the best thing about the neighborhood and probably the only thing keeping him there now that Gloria was gone. He was waiting on the porch when I pulled in, which meant he had heard my truck from inside and come out rather than waiting for me to knock, which was something he had always done, and which I had always found quietly steadying the fact of a person who hears you coming and moves towards you, rather than waiting to see what you need. He looked at me the way he had been looking at me for 43 years, which was directly and without the adjustment people make when they are deciding how much of what they are thinking to show. Raymond had been a corporate attorney for 31 years, and the most useful thing that career had given him, besides a working knowledge of contract law and an ability to read a room faster than anyone I had ever met, was the habit of looking at situations without flinching from what he saw. "You look like you've been carrying something heavy for a long time," he said. 3 months, I said. "Come inside," he said. I made chili. We sat at his kitchen table, the same round oak table he and Gloria had bought at an estate sale in Cheektowaga in 1984, and I ate 2 bowls of chili and told him everything. The cedar box in the basement, the breakfast tray, the album photographs on the floor, the Facebook Marketplace listing for Martha's rocking chair, the recording from the doorbell camera, Dr. Garfield and the cognitive assessment, the debt letter, the work order with Vanessa's name in the field marked sole property owner. I told it in order because I am an engineer and I tell things in order, and because Raymond needed the sequence to understand the structure. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things that had made him a good attorney and made him a better friend. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his chili bowl, and then he said, "Walter, where are your original documents?" "Locked up," I said. He looked at me. "Where?" "The workshop floor," I said. "Floor safe. Combination only, no key backup. I installed it myself in 2007. Martha's idea, she said, important things should be in a place that required you to remember something, not just own something." Raymond sat back in his chair, a slow breath out. "So they have nothing. They have copies," I said. "I keep duplicates in the upstairs filing cabinet. Vanessa found. I noticed the cabinet had been gone through in April. The folders were replaced in the wrong order. She has a copy of the deed, a copy of the survey, a copy of the original mortgage discharge. Copies are unenforceable for transfer of title in New York State," Raymond said. "Under New York real property law, a deed conveys title only when the original is properly executed, acknowledged before a notary, and recorded with the county clerk. A photocopy of a deed proves nothing in court except that a deed exists. It cannot be used to transfer, encumber, or sell the property." "I know," I said. "But they don't know I know." Raymond looked at me for a moment. Then he smiled, the particular smile of a man who has spent 31 years watching people underestimate each other and has developed a deep appreciation for the moments when that goes badly for the person doing the underestimating. "What else is in the floor safe?" he said. "The original deed," I said. "The original survey. Martha's will notarized, witnessed by two independent parties, filed with the surrogates court in Watkins Glen in 2016. The original construction log, every material receipt and contractor invoice from the build, and a letter." "What kind of letter?" "Martha's," I said. "She put it in the safe herself the year before she died. Told me it was there, but asked me not to read it until I felt I needed to. I haven't opened it." Raymond was quiet again. Outside his kitchen window, the maple in the backyard was in full summer leaf, moving slightly in a wind I could not hear through the glass. "All right," he said finally. "Here is what I need you to do." We worked for 2 days at his kitchen table. Raymond drafted a comprehensive inventory of every document in the floor safe and their legal standing under New York property law. He explained that Martha's will, having been properly filed with the surrogates court, was a matter of public record and could not be contested on the basis of a missing original. The court retained its own certified copy. He outlined the process for updating my estate documents to include a revocable living trust, which would allow me to transfer the property into the trust during my lifetime, removing it from the probate process entirely and making any future claim against my estate significantly more difficult to sustain. 2. He also made 3 phone calls that I was not present for, and when he came back from the third one, he said, "I've spoken to a colleague in Albany who handles elder law. If Ethan files a guardianship petition, he'll need to demonstrate incapacity before a Supreme Court judge with an independent court evaluator appointed specifically for you. Your score of 30 on the Montreal assessment and your records from Dr. Patterson will make that petition very difficult to sustain." He sat down. "They're building a house of cards, Walter. Every card they're using is a copy." On the third evening, my phone buzzed on the kitchen table while Raymond and I were going over the trust documents. The message was from Caleb. His name was in my phone because he had texted me once in July asking if the East Porch outlet could handle his equipment, draw a practical question, the kind a careful technician asks. This message was not intended for me. The opening line read, "Confirming for V," and what followed referenced a shooting schedule, a lighting setup, and a confirmation that Thursday at 2 in the afternoon was still on for what the message called the property walkthrough with Kestrel. He had sent it to the wrong contact. Walter and Vanessa, 2 names, same first letter, close enough in a phone list that a tired man sending a quick text doesn't catch the difference until it's already sent. I read it twice. I handed the phone to Raymond without a word. He read it. He set the phone down on the table between us. He looked at me. "Kestrel Realty," he said. "Yes," I said. "How far is it back to the lake?" 6 hours, I said. 5.5 if I don't stop. Raymond nodded slowly. He folded the trust documents and put them in the manila envelope he had prepared for me, everything inside labeled in his neat attorney's hand, every page tabbed. He placed the envelope on top of my bag by the door. "Then you should get some sleep," he said. "You'll want to be there before they are." I went to bed at 10 and lay awake until nearly midnight, not with anxiety, but with the particular alertness of a man who knows the next day is going to require him to be very precise about what he says and how he says it, and in what order. I have felt that alertness before on job sites when something has gone wrong with a structure, and I am the person who has to walk in and tell the truth about what needs to happen next. I was good at that. Martha used to say I was the calmest person she had ever seen in a crisis, and that it had taken her 10 years of marriage to understand that my calm was not indifference, but concentration. I was concentrating now. I made it back in 5 hours and 20 minutes. I had left Raymond's house at 6 in the morning, before the neighborhood was fully awake, with the manila envelope on the passenger seat, and a thermos of coffee. Raymond had pressed into my hand at the door without saying anything about it, because that was how Raymond expressed things he felt strongly about. The drive down from Buffalo follows the western edge of the Finger Lakes, and in July the countryside is as green as it gets. The vineyards coming in along the slopes, the fields full and heavy, the lake flashing between the tree lines whenever the road curved east. I had driven this route hundreds of times in my life, and I knew every landmark, every long straightaway, every curve where the speed limit dropped, and the reason for it. I drove without the radio. I needed the quiet of my own thinking, not the quiet of an empty road, and those are different things. I pulled into my driveway at 11:47 in the morning. There was a car I did not recognize parked behind Ethan's sedan, a white Audi with a magnetic sign on the driver's door that read, Kestrel Realty, alongside a headshot of a woman with a professional smile, and the name Diane Whitmore, licensed associate real estate broker. I sat in my truck for a moment. I looked at Diane Whitmore's professional smile on the side of her car. I picked up my thermos, finished the last inch of coffee, and screwed the cap back on carefully. Then I got out. The front door was unlocked, which it should not have been with a stranger in the house, but that was a smaller problem than the one I was walking toward. I pushed it open and stepped into my front hallway and looked into my living room. Diane Whitmore was standing near the fireplace, my fireplace, the one with Martha's stones, still in place with a tablet computer in her hand, and her head tilted at the angle of professional assessment. She was perhaps 50, trim in a blazer the color of slate, and she was looking at the room the way appraisers look at rooms, measuring its value rather than its meaning. Vanessa stood beside her, one hand resting on the mantel, wearing the expression she wore when things were going according to plan. Ethan was standing near the bookcase. He saw me first. The color left his face in a single movement, the way it leaves the face of a person who has been caught doing something they cannot immediately explain their way out of. His mouth opened slightly and then closed. Vanessa turned a half-second later. Her expression did not collapse the way Ethan's did. It shifted, a small, controlled adjustment, the recalibration of a person who has prepared for contingencies. She looked at me and said with a warmth so practiced it had worn smooth, "Oh, you're back early, Dad." "I'm back when I said I'd be back," I said. Diane Whitmore looked between us with the polite uncertainty of a professional who has walked into a domestic situation she had not been briefed on. Vanessa straightened slightly and turned toward me with the full attention she deployed when she wanted to manage something before it became unmanageable. "Walter," she said, dropping the dad without appearing to notice she had done it. "This is just an informal consultation, a market evaluation. We wanted to understand what the property might be worth for planning purposes, for our family's future." I looked at her. Then I looked at Ethan, who was looking at the floor with the fixed attention of a man studying something that was not actually there. Then I looked at Diane Whitmore, who had the professional composure of someone who had learned to be still in uncomfortable rooms. "Ms. Whitmore," I said, "I apologize for any confusion. I'm Walter Hayes. I own this property." I set my thermos on the side table by the door, the same table where I had set my keys every evening for 35 years, and walked into the living room. "The deed to this house is recorded with the Schuyler County Clerk in my name alone. It has been since August of 1989. No one contacted me about this appointment, and I did not authorize it." Diane Whitmore's professional composure held, but something behind it shifted. She looked at Vanessa. "She said she was a co-owner," Diane said carefully. She mentioned a shared interest in the property through the estate, and there is no shared interest, I said. My wife passed in 2016. The property transferred to me in full at that time per the terms of her will, which has been filed with the surrogate's court. There is no estate interest outstanding. I kept my voice at the same level I used when I addressed subcontractors on job sites, clear, factual, without the particular elevation that signals anger or the particular softness that signals uncertainty. I'd recommend you verify ownership independently before proceeding further. The county clerk's records are public and the search takes about 10 minutes. Diane closed her tablet. She looked at Vanessa once more, a look that was not unfriendly but was entirely professional and entirely done. I think we should reschedule, she said, pending clarification. She picked up her bag from the chair where she had set it and moved toward the door with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had extricated herself from complicated situations before and would again. Vanessa's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. Her jaw tightened in a way I had not seen before. Not the controlled neutrality I was accustomed to, but something harder underneath it, the structure of her composure showing through the surface. "This is a family decision," she said to the room at large, to no one in particular, to the air. "It's my decision," I said. "This is my house." After Diane Whitmore's car had backed out of my driveway, the three of us stood in my living room in the particular silence of people who have just watched something irreversible occur. Ethan's hands were pressed flat against his thighs. A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a boy. Not guilt exactly, but the raw thing underneath guilt, the thing that comes before you have learned to manage it. Vanessa looked at the fireplace. I looked at both of them and felt underneath everything else a tiredness so thorough it had moved past discomfort into something almost peaceful. The tiredness of a man who has been holding something up for a very long time and has finally set it down. "I'm going to my office," I said. "I'd like you both to be available this evening. We need to have a conversation that is long overdue." I picked up my thermos, I walked down the hall, I went into my office and I closed the door and I turned the lock, and in the quiet of that room I stood with my back against the door and looked at my desk and my drafting table and Martha's photograph on the shelf. And I breathed once slowly all the way in and all the way out. Outside the door, I heard Vanessa say something to Ethan in a low voice. I heard Ethan say nothing at all. Good, I thought. Let them think. They had not yet seen what I had brought back from Buffalo. By morning, they would understand exactly what was in that manila envelope and what it meant for every plan they had made in this house without asking me. I sat down at my desk. I opened the envelope. I began to read through the documents one final time, making sure everything was exactly where it needed to be, the way I have always checked my work before the moment it matters most. The conversation that evening was not what either of them had expected. I had asked them to sit at the dining table, the same table where Diane Whitmore's visit had not been discussed, where the good dishes had been used without permission, where 35 years of family dinners had happened before any of this began. I sat across from them with my hands folded and told them in plain language what I knew. The doorbell recording, the debt letter, Dr. Garfield and the cognitive assessment, the work order with Vanessa's name in the ownership field, the call to Kestrel Realty. Ethan stared at the table. His hands were pressed flat on the wood, the way they had been in the living room that afternoon, as if he needed something solid under his palms. Vanessa looked at me with the expression of a person doing rapid internal arithmetic. I did not raise my voice. I did not list grievances or demand apologies. I told them what I knew, and I told them that I had spoken with Raymond, and I told them that my documents were in order, and that any action taken against this property without my explicit written authorization would be addressed accordingly. Then I said good night and went to bed. What I did not tell them was what I intended to do next. I had learned something in 40 years of structural engineering. The most dangerous moment in any compromised structure is not when the problem is discovered, but when the people responsible for the problem believe they still have time to fix it quietly. Ethan and Vanessa believed after that conversation that I had shown them my hand. They did not know I was holding a different hand entirely. The next morning, I came into the kitchen at 7:15 and asked Ethan what day it was. He was at the counter with his coffee, scrolling through his phone. He looked up. "Tuesday," he said. I frowned slightly, the way a man frowns when a simple piece of information requires more effort than it should. "Tuesday," I repeated as if I were filing it away. "Right, of course." I poured my coffee and stood at the window looking out at the lake, and after a moment I said, "Where did I put my reading glasses?" They were in my shirt pocket. They had been in my shirt pocket every morning for 11 years. Ethan watched me pat my cardigan pockets, my trouser pockets, the counter beside the toaster. He watched me check the windowsill above the sink. His eyes moved to Vanessa, who had come into the kitchen doorway and was watching with the focused attention she gave to things she found potentially useful. "They might be in the living room," Ethan said. "Maybe so," I said. I shuffled toward the doorway, not my natural walk, which is purposeful, and even the walk of a man who spent decades moving across construction sites in all weather, but something slower, slightly less certain. "I'll have a look." I found my glasses in the living room, on the bookcase, where I had placed them deliberately before coming to the kitchen. I returned to the kitchen and held them up with mild triumph. "There they are." I put them on. "I don't know where my head is these days." Ethan and Vanessa exchanged a look over their coffee cups. It was the look I had been waiting for, quick, private, the compressed communication of two people who have just received information they consider significant. Ethan's shoulders dropped a fraction. Vanessa's chin lifted slightly with the particular quality of a person recalculating odds in their favor. I shuffled back to my coffee. I repeated variations of this performance over the following 4 days. I asked Ethan the same question twice in one morning, waiting long enough between repetitions that it would seem like genuine forgetting rather than intention. I stood in this hallway looking confused about which door led to the garage which I had used every day for 35 years. I called Vanessa by the wrong name once, Barbara, which was the name of no one connected to anything chosen specifically because it was unmemorable. On the 3rd day, Ethan made a phone call from the back porch that he believed was out of my hearing. My hearing is entirely adequate for my age. I heard him say, "I think it's accelerating. We should move faster." I continued raking the gravel path along the side of the house, making the slow, methodical strokes of a man attending to a small task. On the 4th morning, I came into the kitchen and found Ethan's laptop open on the table. He had gone out to the garage. I heard the door, heard his footsteps on the gravel, and left it running, the screen bright, a document open. I set my coffee mug on the counter. I looked at the screen from where I was standing, which was close enough to read the header at the top of the document, without touching the laptop or moving toward it. The header read, "In the matter of the alleged incapacity of Walter R. Hayes' petition for appointment of guardian of the property." Below the header, in the structured format of a legal filing, was a drafted petition. It cited the evaluation conducted by Dr. Garfield. It listed Ethan R. Hayes as petitioner. It described in the careful language of legal documents a pattern of behavior consistent with cognitive decline, including, and here I read carefully, confusion regarding dates and times, difficulty locating personal items, and repetitive questioning. I stood at the kitchen counter, and read what my son had written about me. My coffee cooled in the mug beside my hand. Outside the window, the lake was flat and silver in the morning light, the way it gets on still days before the wind comes up. I did not touch the laptop. I did not alter my expression. I heard Ethan's footsteps returning across the gravel, and I moved to the kitchen table and sat down with my coffee and picked up the newspaper I had already read and held it open to a page in the middle. Ethan came through the garage door. He glanced at the laptop. He glanced at me. I turned a page of the newspaper. "Morning," I said. "Morning, Dad," he said. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man who was not sure what he had walked back into. "Supposed to rain Thursday," I said, not looking up from the paper. "Yeah," he said. "I think I heard that." He picked up his laptop and took it to the living room. I listened to his footsteps on the hardwood, and then the soft sound of the couch cushion taking his weight. I put the newspaper down. I looked at the lake. The document I had just read was a draft, not filed, not submitted to any court, not yet a legal instrument of any kind. In New York State, a guardianship petition requires submission to the Supreme Court appointment of an independent court evaluator, a formal hearing, and a judge's determination. A draft on a laptop was paper. What it told me was timing, and timing was the thing I now understood very clearly. That evening, I called Raymond. "They're further along than we thought," I said. "How soon can the trust documents be finalized?" "I can have everything ready by end of next week," Raymond said. "Make it Thursday," I said. I went to the workshop at 2 a.m. Not because I had planned that particular hour, but because I had lain awake until 1:45, listening to the house settle into its nighttime sounds, the particular creak of the third stair that had always creaked, the low hum of the refrigerator cycling on the distant sound of the lake against the shore. And I had understood that I was not going to sleep, and that the thing I needed to do was better done now than in daylight. I dressed in the dark. I took my flashlight from the nightstand drawer, the heavy maglite I had carried on job sites for 20 years, reliable as arithmetic, and I went downstairs and through the kitchen and out the back door into the August night. The air outside was warm and still, the way August nights in the Finger Lakes get when the heat of the day holds on past midnight. The workshop was 40 feet from the back of the house, a structure I had built in the summer of 1995 from the same reclaimed lumber as the bookcase with a concrete floor. I had poured myself over 3 weekends, screeding it level with a straight edge until it was flat enough to satisfy me. Martha had brought me lemonade each of those 3 weekends and sat on the saw bench watching, and on the last day she had pressed her handprint into the wet concrete at the corner nearest the door before it set. I had smoothed it over at the time instinctively before understanding what she had done. The handprint was gone. I have thought about that more times than I can count. The floor safe was in the northeast corner beneath a section of removable decking I had laid over the concrete in 2007, 3 boards of quarter-sawn white oak, fitted without gaps, indistinguishable from the rest of the floor, unless you knew exactly where to look and how the third board lifted. I crouched down and pressed my thumb into the seam at the board's edge and lifted it the way I had done perhaps a dozen times in 18 years and set it to the side. The safe was a 9-inch square of brushed steel set flush with the concrete. No keyhole. A 12-digit combination that I had memorized the afternoon I installed it and written nowhere because Martha was right, that important things should require memory rather than possession. I turned the dial 4 times with the flashlight in my left hand, and my right hand steady on the steel, and the mechanism released with the clean sound of something engineered to last. Inside the original deed folded once along its recorded crease. The survey rolled in its tube. Martha's will in its blue legal back, the notary seal still crisp. The construction log. The file of material receipts and contractor invoices organized by trade and date the way I organized everything. And at the back of the safe, standing upright against the steel wall, the small envelope. I took everything out and set it on the decking beside me. I checked each document by flashlight, not because I doubted they were there, but because checking is what I do, and because the act of handling these papers, running my thumb along the edges of documents that represented 35 years of a life built carefully and on purpose, steadied something in me that had been unsteady for a long time. Martha's will was 4 pages. I had read it twice in the weeks after she died, and not since. I read it again now, crouched on my workshop floor at 2 in the morning, and it said what I remembered it saying, that the property at this address, described by its legal parcel number and recorded deed, passed to Walter Raymond Hayes in full without condition upon her death. That her personal effects were to be distributed as described in an attached schedule. That her watercolor instruction materials and her sketchbooks were to go to the community center in Watkins Glen, where she had taught for 11 years, which had been done. There was nothing in the will that gave any other party any claim to anything. I put the will back in its blue legal back. I organized the other documents into the order Raymond and I had agreed upon. Deed first, then survey, then will, then the construction log, then the invoices. I placed them in the manila envelope Raymond had brought from Buffalo and sealed it. Then I picked up the small envelope. It was standard letter-size ivory, the kind Martha bought in bulk from the office supply store in Watkins Glen and used for everything from thank-you notes to grocery lists. My name was on the front, in her handwriting, Walter, in the particular slant she had written with since I had known her. The lowercase letters slightly forward-leaning, as if they were walking somewhere with intention. She had placed it in the safe herself in the fall of 2010, 6 years before she died. I had been in the backyard when she did it. She told me that evening that she had put something in the safe for me and asked me not to read it until I felt I needed to. I had asked her what it was. She had said, "You'll know when it's the right time." I had accepted that because it was the kind of thing Martha said, and because it had always turned out to be true. I turned the envelope over in my hands. The seal was intact. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. 15 years in a steel safe through upstate New York winters had done that. The slight foxing at the corners that paper gets when it has been kept a long time in a place with variable temperature. It felt thin, 1 page, possibly 2. I did not open it. I was not ready. Not tonight. Not in this workshop at 2 in the morning with the August heat pressing through the walls and the rest of this unfinished. I had learned in my engineering career that there is a sequence to things, and that violating the sequence, however strong the temptation, produces inferior results. The envelope belonged to the end of this. I could feel that with the same certainty I felt when a structural calculation was correct. Not because I could prove it in that moment, but because the logic of it was sound. I put the envelope inside my cardigan against my chest. I replaced the documents in the safe. I closed the safe. I replaced the decking. I stood up from the floor, which required a hand on the workbench for the last 6 inches, and I did not make anything of that. I walked back to the house across the dark lawn, the flashlight making a circle of yellow light on the grass ahead of me. The lake a black shape beyond the tree line. The stars very clear in the way. They are clear in August in upstate New York, when there is no wind and no cloud. I went upstairs. I put the envelope on the dresser beside Martha's cedar box. I lay down on top of the covers with my shoes still on, and I looked at the ceiling, and I felt for the first time in months entirely certain of what I was doing and why. At 7 the next morning, I called Raymond. "The documents are ready," I said. "All of them." "Good," he said. "I'll be there Thursday." Vanessa made the announcement at breakfast on a Monday morning in the second week of September. with the particular brightness she reserved for news she considered significant. "We hit 500,000 followers this weekend," she said, setting her phone on the table so the screen faced outward the way people display things they want acknowledged. The number was there in the analytics dashboard, 512,000 to be precise. The count still climbing in small increments as she spoke. "I'm going to do a live celebration stream, Saturday afternoon, right here in the living room." Ethan looked up from his eggs and smiled the smile he had been producing for the past several weeks. Effortful, slightly delayed, the smile of a man running a performance that had become expensive to maintain. "That's great, babe," he said. I looked at the number on her phone. Then I looked at my coffee. "Congratulations," I said. I meant it in the narrow technical sense that 500,000 people had chosen to follow her content, which represented a genuine achievement of a kind I did not personally value, but could recognize as real. What I did not say was that I had been waiting for exactly this kind of occasion, a large public documented moment, for 3 weeks. What I did not say was that Raymond had driven up from Buffalo on Thursday as promised, had sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours, while Ethan and Vanessa were in Ithaca at a brand meeting, and had witnessed my signature on the trust documents and the updated estate paperwork. What I did not say was that the manila envelope was now in the inside pocket of my winter coat, hanging in the hall closet, and that I had checked it was there each morning since Thursday, the way you check a load-bearing joint before you open a structure to traffic. I said none of this. I said, "What time Saturday?" 2 o'clock, Vanessa said. She was already looking at her phone again, composing something. "I'll need the living room from about noon to set up, and the kitchen for the catering spread." She glanced up briefly. "It would be helpful if you could maybe spend the afternoon in your room, just for the background noise." "Of course," I said. Ethan's smile flickered. He looked at his plate. On Friday, Caleb arrived in the late morning with his equipment van, a gray cargo vehicle with the side door that stuck and required a particular upward lift and sideways pull to open, which I had observed him perform the same way every time. He carried his cases through the front door in 3 trips, and on the second trip he passed me in the hallway and stopped. He looked older than he had in July, though only 6 weeks had passed. There was something in his face that had not been there before. Not age exactly, but the particular weariness of a person who has been knowing something uncomfortable for long enough that the knowledge has begun to show. "Mr. Hayes," he said. He shifted the case to his other hand. "How are you doing?" "Well enough," I said. "And you?" He looked at the case in his hand. Then at the living room doorway where Vanessa was directing the placement of furniture with the focused efficiency of a general before a campaign. Then back at me. "I put in my notice last week," he said quietly enough that the words did not carry down the hall. "This is my last job with her." He paused. "I've been doing this work for 8 months, and I've filmed in a lot of people's homes. I know the difference between someone who invited us in and someone who didn't." He looked at the living room again, then back at me. "Tomorrow, whatever happens, I want you to know I'm going to do what's right. Not what I'm paid to do." I looked at him for a moment. He was 28 or 29 years old, standing in my hallway with a camera case in his hand, and the look of a person who had made a decision that cost him something and was not sorry he had made it. "I think that's the right call," I said. He nodded once, adjusted his grip on the case, and went into the living room. I spent Friday afternoon at my drafting table, not drafting anything, but sitting in the chair where I had sat for 35 years of evenings after work, looking at the surface of the table where the wood had worn smooth under my elbows. Martha had given me this table as a gift when I made senior project manager in 2002. She had driven to a specialist woodworking shop in Rochester. To have it made had specified the dimensions herself, based on measurements she had taken of my existing table without telling me why she was measuring it, and had arranged to have it delivered on a Tuesday morning, when she knew I would be on a job site in Syracuse, so she could set it up before I came home. I had walked in that evening and stood in the office doorway looking at it for a long moment before I understood what I was seeing. I had sat at this table every significant evening of the past 23 years. I intended to sit at it for whatever years remained. Dot Simmons called at 5 in the afternoon. "Oven's on and I made too much pot roast," she said, which was her standard opening when she was offering dinner and did not want to make it into an occasion. "You eaten yet?" "Not yet," I said. "Come over whenever," she said. I walked across the lawn at 5:30 through the gap in the privet hedge that had been there since 2001 when a deer had pushed through it, and we had never quite gotten around to filling it back in. Dot's kitchen smelled of pot roast and the particular warmth of a house that had been lived in comfortably for a long time. We ate at her table, and she did not ask me anything directly, which was one of the things I valued most about Dot Simmons. Her understanding that presence is often more useful than questions. She refilled my coffee without being asked, and passed the bread without comment, and let the conversation go wherever it wanted to go, which was mostly nowhere in particular, and was exactly what I needed. When I got up to leave, she walked me to the back door and put her hand on my arm briefly. "You doing all right, Walter?" "I am," I said. And I found saying it, that it was true. I walked back across the dark lawn. The lake was black beyond the trees, the stars very clear. I went inside, checked the hall closet, felt the envelope in the coat pocket. I went to bed at 9:30. I set no alarm. I lay in the dark and thought about nothing for a long time, which is harder than it sounds, and which I have only ever been able to do when I am entirely certain of what the morning requires. I was certain. Before I reveal what happened the moment I stepped in front of 50,000 live viewers, if you're enjoying this on Silent Sweet Revenge, type 30 in the comments right now so I know you're still here with me. And a quick reminder, the following chapter contains dramatized elements that may not be entirely authentic. If you prefer not to continue, you're welcome to stop the video right here. I woke at 5 without an alarm the way I have woken my entire adult life. I made coffee. I sat on the back porch in the early morning dark and watched the lake come visible as the sky lightened the way it does in September. In the Finger Lakes gray, first, then pewter, then a pale and particular gold that lasts about 12 minutes before the full morning takes over. I had watched this happen thousands of times. I watched it carefully now, the way you watch something you love when you understand that the watching is its own kind of keeping. At 7, I went inside and made scrambled eggs. 3 eggs, a knob of butter, low heat. My mother's recipe. I ate them at my kitchen table and read the newspaper and did not think about 2 o'clock. At noon, Vanessa's preparation began. Furniture repositioned, ring lights assembled. The white backdrop panels Caleb erected along the east wall, which he did with the quiet efficiency of a man completing his last professional obligation. He caught my eye once across the living room. I nodded. He nodded. That was sufficient. By 1:30, the living room was unrecognizable as the room I had built in 1989. Every personal object removed or repositioned. The fireplace, Martha's stones still intact, dressed with candles and greenery that belonged to no season in particular. The bookcase pushed 3 feet to the left. Vanessa stood at the center of it all in a cream-colored blouse, her hair arranged, her face composed with the professional attention of a woman who understood that her livelihood existed on the surface of things. I was in my office. I had changed into the blue Oxford shirt that Martha had always said brought out my eyes, which was something she had said so many times over so many years that putting it on felt like a particular kind of conversation. I had the manila envelope on the desk in front of me. I checked the contents one final time, each document in the agreed order, each tab where Raymond had placed it. Everything exactly where it needed to be. At 2 o'clock, I heard Vanessa begin. Her voice shifted into the register I had come to know. Warmer, rounder, slower, the voice she used when she was performing, rather than speaking. I heard the familiar opening, "Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to something really special today." I heard the viewer count announced by her assistant app, a chime that sounded every 10,000. I heard it sound 5 times in the first 4 minutes. I picked up the envelope. I walked down the hall. I stepped into the living room at 2:17. The ring lights were very bright. Vanessa was seated on the repositioned couch, her tablet on her knee, speaking to the camera with the fluency of someone who had done this thousands of times. The stream was running on the main camera, not on her phone, not on her tablet, but through Caleb's professional rig, which he controlled from behind the equipment panel on the east wall. Her phone was face down on the cushion beside her. She saw me in her peripheral vision, and her sentence stopped, not at a natural pause but mid-clause, and in the half-second between seeing me and understanding what I was holding, the moment to end the stream had already passed, not at a natural pause but mid-clause, the way a sentence stops when something unexpected has entered the room. 50,000 people were watching. "Dad!" she said. Her voice had lost its register. It was her actual voice, now higher, tighter. "We're live right now." "I know," I said. I walked to the center of the room and stood beside the fireplace beside Martha's stones, and I looked directly into the camera. "Good afternoon," I said. "My name is Walter Hayes. I am 71 years old. I built this house in 1989, and I have lived in it for 35 years. My wife Martha and I raised our son here. She passed in 2016, and I have lived here alone since then." I paused. "This is my home." I opened the envelope. I placed the first document on the coffee table face up where the camera could see it. 1-6, this is the original deed to this property recorded with the Schuyler County Clerk in August of 1989 in my name alone. I placed the second document beside it. This is a contract signed by my daughter-in-law Vanessa Hayes in which she represents herself as the sole legal owner of this property for the purposes of a brand sponsorship. She is not the owner. I placed the third document. This is a letter from a financial recovery firm addressed to my son Ethan Hayes regarding $247,000 in personal debt. I placed the fourth. And this is a draft petition for guardianship of my property authored by my son, citing a pattern of cognitive decline. In May of this year, I was administered the Montreal Cognitive Assessment by a physician of my son's choosing. I scored 30 out of 30. The room was absolutely still. Vanessa stood up from the couch. Her face had gone the color of the cream-colored blouse. "You need to stop," she said. Her voice was shaking in a way I had not heard from her before, not the controlled vibration of managed emotion, but something genuine and unsteady. "You need to stop right now." "I'm finished," I said. "I've said what needed to be said." I looked at Ethan. He was standing near the bookcase, his hands at his sides, his face doing something complicated and painful that I did not look away from because I owed him the honesty of witnessing it. He looked at Vanessa. He looked at the camera. He looked at the documents on the table. Something moved through him. I watched it move, watched it reach his hands, which rose slightly from his sides, and then fell. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone. His fingers moved on the screen. He looked up at Raymond's number and pressed call, and when Raymond answered, Ethan said in a voice that had gone flat and exhausted, "I need to give you something." texts, all of them, from the beginning. Vanessa made a sound I will not describe in detail except to say that it was the sound of something that had been under considerable pressure for a long time releasing all at once. She sat back down on the couch. She pressed both hands over her face. Caleb, without a word, reached behind the main camera and pressed a button. The recording light went dark. He began quietly and methodically to break down his equipment. He worked with the care and attention of a craftsman packing tools he respected, and he did not look at Vanessa. And when he carried the last case out the front door, he pulled it closed behind him with the soft, definitive sound of someone who did not intend to return. I gathered the documents from the coffee table. I straightened them against my palm the way you straighten papers before returning them to a folder, edges aligned, not rushed. I put them back in the envelope. The living room's very quiet. "We'll talk tonight," I said to both of them. All three of us, at the dining table. I walked back down the hall to my office. I sat at Martha's drafting table. I put the envelope down. I put both hands flat on the worn wood surface of the table, and I breathed once carefully, all the way in and all the way out. Outside the window, the lake was the color of hammered silver in the afternoon light. The same color it had always been. The same color it would be tomorrow. The dinner that evening was not a dinner. I had said we would talk at the dining table, and we did, the three of us, no food. Just the table and the chairs and the particular quality of light in that room at 7 in the evening in September, when the sun comes through the west window at a low angle and makes everything look more significant than it might otherwise. I had sat at this table for 35 years of significant and ordinary evenings, and I had learned to tell the difference. I let them sit first. Ethan chose the chair he had always taken as a boy, to my left, slightly angled as if positioning himself for a quick exit. Vanessa sat across from him. She had composed herself since the afternoon, which I had expected. She was very good at composing herself. The evidence of what had happened was visible only in a certain tightness around her eyes and the way she held her coffee mug in both hands, which she did not usually do. I sat at the head of the table. I folded my hands. "I'm not here to discuss what happened this afternoon," I said. "That's done. I want to talk about what happens next." Ethan looked at his hands. Vanessa looked at me. "Raymond will be filing the completed trust documents with the county this week," I said. "The property will be held in the Martha Hayes Preservation Trust, upon my death, with the Finger Lakes Land Trust designated as primary beneficiary. The trust terms are irrevocable." I looked at Ethan when I said the next part, because it was important that he heard it clearly and understood I was not being careless with it. "You are not named as a beneficiary, Ethan. That is not a decision I made in anger. It is a decision I made because the circumstances required it." Ethan's jaw worked. His eyes went bright in the way eyes go when a person is fighting something that wants to come out. He pressed his lips together and looked at the table. Vanessa said, "You can't just, 'I can,' I said. Under New York law, a property owner has the unqualified right to establish a trust and designate any beneficiary he chooses. There is no legal requirement to include a child. Raymond has confirmed this. The documents are signed and witnessed." She stopped. I continued. "I am also asking you both to find other living arrangements. I am giving you 30 days from today, which is more time than the situation warrants, and which I am offering because I am not interested in being unreasonable." I set the envelope on the table, the same envelope that had been in my coat pocket, that I had checked each morning, now emptied of its documents, and carrying only the notice to quit that Raymond had prepared. I slid it across to Ethan. "This is a formal notice prepared by Raymond Kowalski, who is acting as my attorney in this matter. It documents the 30-day period and the terms. Ethan picked up the envelope. He looked at it the way people look at things they already know are true, but had hoped until the moment of contact might still turn out not to be. The call from Raymond came the following Tuesday. He had spoken with the attorneys for 3 of Vanessa's primary brand sponsors. 2 had already sent formal notices of contract termination, citing the misrepresentation of property ownership in the sponsorship agreements. The 3rd was in the process of doing the same and had indicated it intended to pursue civil damages for the costs incurred in reliance on the fraudulent ownership claim. How much, I asked. The damages claim from the 3rd sponsor alone is likely to exceed $90,000, Raymond said. The other 2 are smaller but not insignificant, and Vanessa's legal fees will add to that. A pause. She's going to have a difficult time. I looked out my kitchen window at the lake. A heron was standing in the shallows near the dock, the way herons stand absolutely still with the patience of something that has been doing this long enough to know the fish will come. Yes, I said, she is. I did not feel satisfaction when I said it. I want to be honest about that because satisfaction would have been the simpler thing to feel, and it would not have been accurate. What I felt was the particular tiredness of a situation that had required more than it should have, and the recognition that what was coming for Vanessa was the consequence of choices she had made, and not something I had done to her. Ethan came to my office door that same Tuesday evening. He knocked the way he had knocked as a teenager twice. Soft, giving me the option to pretend I hadn't heard. "Come in," I said. He stood in the doorway. He was thinner than he had been in March. 6 months of living wrong does that to a person, sometimes hollows them out, in ways that show around the eyes and in how they hold their shoulders. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "The debt." He swallowed. "The $247. I know you don't owe me anything. I know that. But I don't know how I'm going to—" He stopped. His voice had frayed at the edges. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment, which was something he had done as a boy when he was trying not to cry in front of me. I looked at my son. I saw the boy he had been and the man he had become, and the distance between those 2 things, which was a distance he had traveled, and I had not been able to prevent. "No," I said. He nodded. One small movement, his chin dropping and rising. He had known the answer before he asked. I think he had needed to ask anyway, the way people sometimes need to hear a door close before they can begin to understand that they have to find another way through. "Okay," he said. His voice was steady. He had steadied it deliberately, and I noticed that, and I thought it was probably the first genuinely adult thing I had seen him do in 6 months. "Ethan," I said before he turned to go. He looked at me. "You're going to be all right," I said. "Not because of anything I'm going to do, because of what you're going to have to figure out yourself, but you will be." He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad, for all of it." "I know," I said. He pulled the door behind him. I sat at Martha's drafting table and listened to his footsteps move down the hall, and I thought about the 30 days ahead, which I already knew would pass. The way hard things pass slowly at first, and then all at once. The 30 days passed the way I said they would, slowly at first, then all at once, and then they were simply gone. Ethan knocked on my bedroom door at 10 o'clock on a Friday night in early October, 2 weeks into the fall color, when the maples along the lake road had gone the particular red that only happens for about 8 days a year before the wind takes the leaves and the branches go bare. I had been sitting in the wingback chair beside the window, not reading, just sitting with the lamp on, and the lake dark beyond the glass. "Come in," I said. He opened the door and stood in the frame the way he had stood in door frames, his entire life half in half, out one hand on the jamb, as if he needed the option of the hallway behind him. He was wearing the old gray sweatshirt from his college years that I had seen him wear on Saturday mornings for 15 years. It was too big for him now. He had lost weight since March. "I wanted to talk," he said. "If that's okay." "Sit down," I said. He took the chair across from mine, Martha's chair, the one I had not moved since she died, the one I had not invited anyone to sit in since she died. He sat carefully the way you sit in a chair that belongs to someone else. "I don't know how to start," he said. "Then start anywhere," I said. He pressed both hands between his knees and looked at the floor. "I told myself for a long time that I wasn't doing anything wrong, that we needed help, that you had more than enough, that it wasn't hurting anyone." He stopped. "I knew it was wrong. I knew it from the beginning. I just kept telling myself a different story, because the real one was too hard to look at." I did not say anything. He needed the room to finish. "She didn't make me do any of it," he said. "I know that's what it probably looked like. But she didn't." I opened the door. "I told her it was fine. I told her you wouldn't push back." His voice cracked on the last word, a clean break like a board splitting along the grain. "I'm sorry, Dad. Not for getting caught. I'm sorry because it was wrong, and because you deserved better than what I gave you." I looked at my son, at his hands pressed between his knees, at the gray sweatshirt too loose on his shoulders, at the face that was Martha's face arranged differently, the same jaw and the same habit of looking down when something was difficult. "I know," I said. "I believe you." He looked up. His eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it, which was something I had not seen from him in 20 years, and which cost him something to offer, and cost me something to receive. "You haven't lost me," I said. "I want you to understand that. What we had before this, that's still there. But I need you to earn your way back to it. Not for my sake. For yours." He nodded. He pressed his mouth together. He breathed. "Good night, son," I said. "Good night, Dad," he said. He stood, looked once more at the chair he had been sitting in. Martha's chair, and something moved across his face that I think was recognition. Then he stepped back into the hallway and pulled the door softly behind him. I sat alone in the lamp-lit room. I looked at Martha's chair, still holding the impression of where Ethan had sat. I looked at her cedar box on the dresser. I thought about the envelope on the nightstand, still sealed, still waiting. Not yet, I thought. One more day. They left on a Saturday morning in the second week of October, when the maples were at their peak, and the lake was the color of hammered silver in the early light. Vanessa carried her ring lights to the car herself, 3 trips walking past me in the front hallway each time without speaking. On the last trip, she stopped at the door and said without turning around, "I hope you're satisfied." Then she walked out. I did not answer. There was nothing in that sentence that required one. Ethan came last. He stood in the front hallway with his keys in his hand and looked at the house the way people look at places they are leaving and know they are leaving for good, taking inventory, trying to hold something that is already going. He looked at the fireplace. He looked at the bookcase. He looked at me. He crossed the hallway and put both arms around me the way he had when he was small, without hesitation, without conditions, the full weight of it. I held on longer than I had planned. "Call me," I said. "I will," he said. Then he walked out, and the door closed, and I stood in my front hallway alone and listened to the cars back out of the driveway and drive away down the lake road until I could not hear them anymore. The house was quiet. The good kind. Dot Simmons came across the yard an hour later with a casserole and did not say much, which was exactly right. We drank coffee on the back porch and watched a pair of geese cross the water, and she went home and I went inside. I took the clock from the hall closet, Martha's clock, the one Vanessa had removed from the wall above the side table. I carried it to the hallway and rehung it on its nail, leveling it by eye, the way I level everything. Behind the mounting bracket, where the wall met the backing plate, was a small recess I had not noticed in 30 years of the clock hanging there. Martha had built the clock mount herself, a Saturday project, in the fall of 2010. The same fall she told me she had put something in the safe for me. I had assumed the safe was the only place. I had been wrong about that. Inside the recess was the ivory envelope, undisturbed, still sealed, the paper foxed slightly at the corners, the way paper gets when it has been kept a long time in a place with variable temperature. I carried it to the kitchen table. I sat down. I held it in both hands for a moment. 15 years of waiting, one morning in October, the light coming through the west window the way it always had. I opened it. Martha's handwriting. One page. She wrote that she had watched me carry this house and this family for as long as she had known me, and that she had sometimes worried I carried it at the cost of myself. She wrote that if I was reading this, something hard had happened, and that she was sorry she was not there to sit with me through it. She wrote, "Keep this house for yourself, Walter. You built it. You earned it. You deserve to be peaceful in it." And at the bottom, in the slightly larger letters she used when she meant something, "Most I have always been proudest of your patience. But I hope you know that knowing when to stop being patient is its own kind of strength." I folded the letter carefully. I put it in my shirt pocket against my chest. I made coffee. I sat at my table. Outside, the lake was silver and still. The geese were gone. The maples burned red along the far shore. "Welcome home," I said to the empty kitchen. I meant it for myself. I have told you this story because I think it needed to be told. Not for sympathy. Not to paint my son as a villain or myself as a saint. But because I spent 6 months being patient when I should have been clear, and the difference between those two things nearly cost me everything Martha and I built together. Here is what I know now at 71, standing in a house that still holds the shape of every year we lived in it. A quiet man is not a weak man, but a man who stays quiet when his home, his dignity, and his memory are being taken. That is not patience. That is surrender dressed up as kindness. I believe God gives us exactly enough time to correct our mistakes if we are willing to move when the moment arrives. I moved. Later than I should have, but I moved. My personal opinion, and I offer it plainly, is that family justice does not require cruelty. It requires clarity. These revenge stories family tells itself about who deserved what and who was wronged. They only end well when someone chooses truth over comfort. That is the only family justice worth having. These revenge stories family carries can destroy everyone or free everyone. The difference is honesty. If this reached you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. We tell them honestly here. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements created purely for reflection and perspective. If that is not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you best.